Hello everyone, my name is Yuliia and welcome to Multicultural's Community Hour. In this segment, we are talking about civic issues in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My guest today is Christina Maes Nino. She is an executive director of Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association. Hello Christina, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me today.
And today we are talking about affordable housing and navigating the system of supporting housing and ways which can help all people in Winnipeg find a place to live. So first of all, Christina, can you tell us what is affordable house is and what is housing crisis is? Because I think a lot of people think we know what it really is, but when I actually dig into it, I think there are a whole bunch of things underneath of it. So can you tell us?
Yeah, there are a lot of layers to affordable housing. Even the definition of affordable housing is not agreed upon across Canada. Affordable housing really, the question always comes up, affordable to who? Mm-hmm. So generally we agree across Canada that if someone is spending about 30% of their income on rent or less, then their housing is considered to be an affordable situation. Once it increases, and especially once someone's spending more than, say, 50% or half of their income on rent, then they're at risk of losing that housing because they don't have enough money left over for food and for medicine and other things that people need. But again, it's all relative. So something that's affordable to a household making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year would be very different for a low-income individual or family. So at the Nonprofit Housing Association, when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about housing that is affordable to low-income Manitobans. And that usually the way that it's been developed in Canada is housing that is rent geared to income. So a nonprofit organization or government has a building, and those rents vary based on the family income, and essentially the government tops up the additional cost through some sort of subsidy. So the household is only paying 30% of their income on rent, and then the full cost of that housing is subsidized so that the family can afford to live there.
And who is eligible to apply for affordable housing?
Again, that varies. It's based on income, but it's also based on need. So in Manitoba, there's a social housing agreement that says that households under, I think it's about $80,000 in income per year, qualify to live in social housing. It's slightly less for single individuals. But then actually getting into that housing is usually based on need. So when someone applies for social housing or subsidized housing, people who are experiencing domestic violence, people who are experiencing homelessness, families with kids, those groups are prioritized to get into that housing first. Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about Winnipeg and housing crisis, what factors contribute to that in Winnipeg?
Across Canada and the globe, actually, there's some big systemic factors that are contributing to the housing crisis. In particular, over the past 30 years or so, I think increasingly people have seen housing as an investment, whereas in the past it was seen as a home. So now there are investment groups that are purchasing housing and they make a profit off increasing the rents and the cost of that housing. That's certainly contributing to increased costs across Canada. In Winnipeg, there are some other factors. Poverty is a major issue for many households and individuals. So there are barriers to employment, low wages, those sorts of things. So if you don't have enough income, then of course affording housing is a challenge. And then recently we've also seen some issues with supply chain issues, or just the cost of housing. The cost of development has gone up quite a bit. And it's gone up faster than incomes have gone up. So there's a few things happening at the same time. All of that is contributing to a crisis in Winnipeg and also across Canada.
Adequate housing is a fundamental human right that is recognized in international law. So why homelessness is still a big issue in our country, in our province?
Well, I think like any right, any human right, the paper that we sign, the declaration that governments make, is only as good as the action that they put behind it. Since the 1990s, the investment that governments have made into affordable housing has actually gone down substantially. It's gone up a little bit over the past 5 years, but it's still substantially lower than it was prior to 1992. So that's a huge factor. And then I think it's also the political will and the public seeing a home or as an investment instead of seeing it as something that everyone deserves and has a right to. We really need to change our mindset and if gold were a human right, then we'd have to have different conversations about how we deal with the gold trading. We don't really need gold, but people need a home. There's clear reasons why people experiencing homelessness are at risk of violence, of dying young. So homelessness really is a death sentence for people. And so if we believe that it's a right, then we need to put our action and our money behind that. And that's something that we haven't done yet.
Who is responsible for this situation?
Well, we all are, and in particular, in our country, we elect governments to fulfill the rights and obligations that we've all agreed upon as a society that we want. So partly we are because we elect that government and we ask them to do things, and they should be responding to us. But because it is a human right, governments have a very clear and legal obligation to fulfill that right through financial resources.
And is there enough investment in affordable housing in Manitoba? You mentioned that it actually goes down in the recent.
Yeah, so there's all levels of government are involved in housing, and so there's been changes in how sometimes the provincial government will invest and sometimes the federal government will invest. The municipal governments also play a role, less so with money, but more about making sure land is available, making sure that they're approving developments that are going to meet the needs of the residents and especially a growing population. So nationally, that's where our government tends to have the most resources. And so nationally, the amount of investment into affordable housing decreased in the 90s, has gone up a bit, but is still too low. Provincially, the amount that the government has invested in housing has also gone down. Right now, there is some funding at the provincial level available for, we have a really great program called Rent Assist in Manitoba that provides a subsidy for lower income individuals and families to be able to afford rent. So it's an income supplement really for renters. And so that's an excellent program because it provides very low income people more money to be able to pay the rent. The issue that it doesn't address is the gap in the supply of housing. So people might have a bit more money, but it's still not enough to afford the rent at the level that it is. It's tied to median market rent. So it's 70% of median market rent, but that means you have this 30% gap for folks. So the investment into the capital, like the actual building of housing, has gone down and certainly isn't where it's needed to be. And then the city has a few programs. It has a bigger program than it's ever had before called Affordable Housing Now, where they have what's called tax increment financing. So it's a grant upfront for affordable and nonprofit housing development that is, it offsets the increased taxes that development would have over a certain number of years. So that's a good program, but it's not enough to cover the full cost to really make it affordable to the low-income households. So that's why we need all three players to come together for a new development or a project to be successful.
Why have human rights been so difficult to implement in Canada?
Oh, that is, we could spend
huge
hours
questions.
talking about that here today. I would say it sort of goes back to that systemic discussion about whether or not we as Canadians all agree that this is a human right, and if we're willing to put the weight behind it, which is real money that's needed to fulfill that human right to housing. So when we see our neighbors, our family members, our friends experiencing homelessness, we don't, I think as a society, until we experience it or we know people experiencing homelessness or housing challenges, we have a tendency to separate ourselves from folks and blame individual factors. So we might say, well, this person has a mental illness, or this person has isn't working, and we don't understand that could be any of us, and it's not. There are millions of Canadians with mental illness who don't experience homelessness. The ones who do experience homelessness have fallen through gaps in systems, and we're the ones that create those systems. We're the ones who vote for the people who create those systems, and so we can change it if we want to, if we decided to come together and demand that we don't have homelessness in our city.
Is there any ways to stop homelessness in our country?
There is. There's. Many countries have substantially reduced homelessness. There will always be people who struggle and who have those individual challenges in their lives. We all have individual challenges in our lives. The folks who I've known, who I've talked to who experience homelessness, tend to be folks who have experienced trauma. So sometimes it's refugees from war, it's people who have, it's Indigenous people who have been separated from their families or their land, or have had other colonial traumas imposed on them. It's people with who've faced abuse, domestic violence. So those things are going to happen to people. They happen across the world in every society. But some countries respond to those better through solutions that mean that people don't fall through the cracks. So in many countries in Europe, in Austria, for example, there's about 20% of the housing in Austria is public housing. So that has made the market more affordable. And so there are other, and Nordic countries, for example, where people can sort of expect that at some point in their lives they're going to need affordable housing when they're a student, if they separate from their family, all those sorts of things that we all go through in life. They, at that time when their income's low, they live in social housing. It's fine. It's good. And then they move on and live in private market housing. In Canada, we don't have enough of that nonprofit or public housing to support those transitions for people. So it's really become, unfortunately, it's often seen as the last resort, and it's not enough for all those people who really need it.
And how many people are in the waiting list for supporting houses?
It varies. So the way that nonprofit or that social housing is managed in Manitoba, that about half of it is owned and managed by the provincial government, and the other half is owned and managed by a lot of nonprofit organizations. So small, often quite small community organizations, church groups, sometimes like kinsmen's clubs, Lions clubs, ethnocultural associations. Those groups at some point raised funds to build a building and own that housing. And so each of those organizations actually has their own wait list. Mm-hmm. So we don't know how many people are on all of those. It's 200 organizations. We know in Manitoba housing, it varies between 4,000 and 6,000 in any given year, the number of people on the wait list. So that's a good indication of the need, and we know that there's probably more who need it that aren't on that Manitoba housing wait list.
Are there cities in Canada that have best practices on managing housing needs for changing and growing populations?
There are, I think, every city has different challenges. British Columbia recently, just yesterday, made an announcement that they put $500 million into a fund that allows nonprofit organizations to purchase private rental housing. So that's a huge deal because the private market is increasing in cost substantially, whereas nonprofits over time stay affordable because there's no profit motivation. That's not that extra money is not going to investors; it's going to keeping rents low. So that's a great practice. So that will make a difference. But BC, the cost of housing is so high right now that they really are catching up from some real challenges that they're facing. The sort of superstar city in Canada that has the most affordable rental housing is Montreal. They have the provincial government and the city government have really seen the investment in public and nonprofit housing as a priority. And that has kept housing more affordable in the province of Quebec as well as specifically in Montreal. So there's different examples that we can learn from, take ideas from. In the end, each solution has to be tailored to the market and the context of the city.
You mentioned before that you work a lot with refugees, and so how do you communicate with these people? Because I think their English is not very well. Is there any difficulties?
Well, there are. So a number of nonprofits are specifically aimed at working with refugees. So our organization is an association of those 200 nonprofit groups. We don't serve refugees directly, our members do. And some of them specialize in that. So for example, the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba, or IRCOM, Welcome Place, they have buildings that are specifically for refugee families and individuals when they arrive in Canada. They have staff who are multicultural. Many of them are refugees themselves. And so I'm sure the team at IRCOM speaks at least 20 languages. There's also a really great organization called New Journey Housing. New Journey Housing specifically works with newcomer households to help them find housing. Their team, I think they speak probably 25 languages amongst their staff team. So if we're working with one of our members, a nonprofit that might only speak English amongst their staff, and they have a household moving in that needs translation, they can reach out to those partners. So they could call New Journey Housing and say, hey, I need help communicating with this family. And nonprofits are really great at developing those partnerships. There's an organization called SAM Management, and during the past year with a lot of Ukrainian refugees coming to Canada, they developed a partnership with some church groups. So the church groups volunteered and helped to do translation for the families that were moving in. So those types of community partnerships really are what make nonprofit housing so successful and really support the tenants to be successful.
Searching for housing is a stressful time, the pressure of which can lead to anxiety and depression, especially when you realize that the price is really so high. How to avoid negative outcomes like this and how to keep searching?
Yeah, it's persistence is really important. I think the knowing that you're not alone and that it's not your fault for people experiencing housing crises, and there's a lot of stigma attached to homelessness. Whenever I've worked with people experiencing homelessness, they blame themselves first. And I think it's important for people to know that that homelessness is not their choice and it's not their fault. It's a systemic issue. That doesn't help you day to day. It might help with some of the anxiety and stress, but reaching out for help to organizations like New Journey Housing. There are a lot of community organizations that are able to support to the best extent possible. They can help people apply for that program like Rent Assist that I mentioned. So there are resources to support. And we need to work together to convince our governments and our friends and neighbors to also convince our governments to invest in affordable housing, because that's really the only way that we're going to make a difference over the long term.
Nowadays, the Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association represents over 100 nonprofit housing providers who collectively own and manage more than 24,000 affordable homes. So do you remember the day, how it started, and what was the impetus for it?
Yeah, so the association started in 2011. I've been with the association for about 5 years, so it was before my time. But really, the impetus was that there are about 200 nonprofit groups, about 100 have joined MANFA. And because they tend to be small, they tend to have 1 or 2 employees. They have boards of directors who are volunteers, and it can be a bit isolating to feel like you're doing this work, and providing affordable housing is tough work. So they were often feeling like they were doing it alone. And there were a group of leaders, of executive directors of nonprofit housing groups who were getting together for coffee regularly and saying, this is great to have these colleagues that I can share ideas with, that I can share concerns with, that we can learn from. What if we started an association so that all of the nonprofits in Manitoba can benefit from these networks? And so that was part of the impetus. The other was that there's a changing relationship between the nonprofit sector and with governments. So much of the housing, the social housing in Manitoba that was built before the 1990s had long-term funding agreements with governments that were tied to the life of the mortgage of a building. So if the building was built in 1990, it might have a 30-year mortgage, so then that funding agreement will expire after 30 years. And once it expires, the nonprofit is really on its own and can, for better or worse, do whatever it wants, but also needs to do everything by itself. And so there's benefits to that, but there's also huge challenges. We saw recently that one of the biggest nonprofit organizations in Manitoba, Lions Housing, chose to sell the building because they don't have the financial means to support all of their buildings. So that group of housing leaders had seen that coming. They knew that was happening. They had those agreements themselves, and they decided to work together to help each other and help themselves to plan for the future so they would be sustainable, so that they're not in a position where they feel like they need to sell the building in 30 years, but actually it can continue to offer really good affordable housing for decades to come.
Mm-hmm. The demand level for affordable housing is at an all-time high and inventory is very low. Are we able to keep up with the demand with population levels expected to rise to new heights? Is there an affordable housing crisis ahead of us?
We're certainly not keeping up with demand. We've been building about 125 units of affordable housing each year. The most recent data we have shows that there are about 35,000 households in core housing need. So core housing need means that they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing, so they can't afford their home. So 100, 200, even 300 units a year is a drop in the bucket. It's important, it's better than nothing, but it's not keeping up with the demand. The federal national housing strategy that was announced in 2018 is slowly ramping up, and there are some more resources there, but we definitely need more if we want to meet the need.
Just to wrap up, let's look ahead of 2023. Where do you see Manitoba in regard to affordable housing, and what projects are you going to achieve in this year?
There are some exciting projects. This year is nonprofit housing. There was a study that found that from idea to build tends to be about a 7-year timeline. So it is a long-term investment in time just to get the building built. Getting the building built is actually the easy part. It's managing it and maintaining it over time is also is really where the challenge is. However, there are some really exciting projects. I think the Village project at Main and Higgins, I think they just announced yesterday that they're open. Folks are moving in there. So that's a tiny home village for people experiencing homelessness that's managed by Indigenous organizations. The Hudson Bay building being transferred to Southern Chiefs. They're going to be building hundreds of units of affordable housing for Indigenous households. That's going to change downtown Winnipeg and will be a huge major investment in affordable housing. So there is some really exciting work happening, and we need to see if we could see one of those projects coming up every couple of months, then we'd really be getting somewhere.
It sounds really exciting. Thank you, Christina. I think with that, we are going to conclude our today's discussion.
Thank you.
And thank you, our audience, for joining us today. We hope you enjoy it. If you like the episode, please like, share, and subscribe to see our upcoming episodes.